for more on this, let's speak to David Swanson. He's the spokesman for the UN's Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs, better known as OHCA. David, thanks for joining us here on TRT World. Now, there's obviously a terrible moment in this brutal war. What can the international community do to stop things like this happening?
Well, as your reporter pointed out, Syria continues to remain a humanitarian crisis of epic proportions, a fact underscored by yesterday's deadly airstrikes, which killed dozens and killed dozens more, many of them women and children. Under international humanitarian law, such attacks, as your reporter pointed out, are inexcusable. They're completely unacceptable, and all parties of this conflict are reminded of their responsibilities in the protection of civilians, the protection of civilian infrastructure, and particularly for civilians who are fleeing with their families to places for safe haven, for protection. This was a horrendous incident and one of grave concern for the United Nations and for the broader international humanitarian community. And as the Emergency Relief Coordinator pointed out yesterday in his statement, there can never be impunity for this type of behavior.
Okay, and David, as you mentioned, this attack inexcusable, but is there any reason why a camp like this would be targeted in this way? No.
Under international humanitarian law, the targeting of civilians under no circumstances is acceptable. Indiscriminate attacks on civilians must stop immediately, and there also must need to be full, unhindered, and unconditional, safe and sustained access to all people in need, including places like this, including in places where people need assistance in camps. It's an incredibly challenging environment in which we as humanitarians have to provide humanitarian assistance to camps that are actually being what appears to be targeted.
And David, we've spoken to people on the ground in and around this area who say they are sick of condemnation by the international community. Children are dying. Red lines have been crossed repeatedly. Just what needs to be done and what should happen to try and make sure this doesn't happen in the future?
Okay, well, we would remind all parties to the conflict and parties that have influence over those parties that they must unequivocally live up to their obligations under international humanitarian law, not just in places like Idlib in Aleppo, but across the country. So in this case, there are people outside the parties of the conflict, so it's important that they put pressure on parties to the conflict to make sure that international humanitarian norms are adhered to.
David, reminding is one thing, but what can actually be done? Because I'm sure that they know that these can be classed as war crimes.
Well, all we can do at this point is continue to remind them. And there have been war crimes in the past that have occurred, and these things do come back up in history. These actions will not be cannot be allowed to go forward in impunity, and I don't think that's going to happen now. We must put an end to the massive suffering of the Syrian people. It's an extremely frustrating environment. I mean, we're talking about a crisis that has already gone well beyond 5 years. So the recent escalation of violence in places like Aleppo and the airstrike continues to put civilians at risk and hamper humanitarian deliveries, and we must put a stop to this.
And finally, David, specifically for the survivors of this attack and more widely in Syria, what's needed currently in terms of humanitarian aid to help those internally displaced people?
Well, across Syria today, we have 13.5 million people in need. Of these, 6.5 million people are internally displaced. As you're well aware, close to 5 million people have fled Syria since the crisis began in 2011, many of them to Turkey. Close to 1 million have fled to Europe. And we need to do more, not just from the politician standpoint, but also from the humanitarian standpoint. Right now, despite generous funding by donors, of the $3.18 billion requested under the 2016 Syria Humanitarian Response Plan, just 14% has been funded to date. Again, let me repeat that. Of the $3.18 billion requested for humanitarian assistance in 2016, just 14% has been funded. So it's also a call for donors to completely understand the situation and realize how urgently their support is needed to provide life-saving, essential assistance to these people.
Absolutely. And David, just finally and quickly, if you can, please, just 14% has been actually received. Where's the rest of the money, and what pressure can be put to make sure the rest of that money is paid as promised?
Well, we always have to continue to. This is a difficult environment to work in, and people sometimes have the illusion that when money is pledged, it immediately hits the ground running. It does take months. So we would ask all donors to step up their efforts to ensure that funds are in place so that people can be provided the life-saving essential assistance they need.
Okay, well, David Swanson, we do appreciate your time. I have to leave it there, but thanks very much for joining us here on TRT World. Thank you.